Good morning all. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to the elders past and present and Aboriginal people in the room. Thank you for the welcome and thanks to AHO for the invitation today. I'm speaking a few times over the conference, so I've got a staged presentation. If you can't catch me out of the sessions, Stacey Broadbent's here as well somewhere. There she is next to the pole. So she's one of the key managers involved in this transition arrangement, so please by all means catch her. I'll go through give a broad overview I think in this presentation and cover off on some of these types of issues. I know we talked about acronyms before, so NRSCH, that's the national system, PARS is the New South Wales performance assessment system, provider assessment system that managed through my office on behalf of the AHO. We'll talk about some of the comparative issues there. That's my role. Important to note that it does work as part of a national system and all the registrars have got the same role. Some of the registrars have got different types of functions, but as in the role of registrar, we're all very much the same, and even the two non-participating states of Western Australia and Victoria, the registrars in those two states participate in very similar ways. I do have this additional function of providing assessments on performance of ACHPs for the Aboriginal Housing Office. And so I can provide an initial reflection which echoes some of the comments we've already heard today, but from a regulatory perspective. The Aboriginal housing sector itself in New South Wales is a very diverse sector, and that echoes the requirements of national law for diversity. Spread across New South Wales and servicing some of the most disadvantaged communities, not only in housing, but health, education and employment. Those things we now lovingly call wraparound services. Many of you are a one-stop shop for tenants, clients, communities, and often seen as the hub for your particular community. So you're already well placed to achieve a lot of the government objectives. You're already doing these wraparound services, which is a big aim of some of these transition arrangements. Where the weaknesses are is obviously in some of the financial capacity we talked about going forward, and governance arrangements, and those are the sorts of things that will be important in transitioning to a national system, as we talked about through the Victorian experience by Darren. The objectives of the National Charter that all the registrars operate under echo a lot of the sentiments that Shane talked to. And certainly present in the Minister's mind in assuring these transfer arrangements occur well, but also create long-term sustainability of the sector. Under our charter, all the registrars operate to a set of principles which we hold dearly and we're held accountable for in all of our operations. None of us are law enforcement type regulators. We're much more of a monitoring, performance assessment, intelligence type service. We do have enforcement powers, and we'll talk about those later on, but they're mainly employed to assist organisations improve their performance rather than take judicial action against organisations. These are my functions under the Act. So to echo those sentiments, you'll see that there are some compliance orientated type of functions, but most of my functions are about registering, monitoring performance and advising on performance in the sector, because the objects of the law that I work to are quite clear and are quite different from a lot of other regulators. There's no sense in the objects of the Act of enforcing compliance. The objects of the Act are oriented towards ensuring financial viability of the sector, sustainability of the sector, the reputation of the sector, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and assuring government risk is mitigated in its transfer of that risk to providers. That's an overview of social housing in a broader sense in New South Wales as at mid last year. And so the sector that I formally regulate's the 18%, but I also do some assistance work for the AHO with the Aboriginal housing components of it as well. And I see into some of the public housing things through homelessness services, etc. So what are we trying to do in government policy? They're taking that 19%, what I call the regulated system, community housing system, and making it about 35% over the next couple of years. In other words, the scale of community housing as a proportion of the sector is going to double in this next few years with housing transfers and a range of other opportunities. I call the other part unregulated, which some people have a problem with, because if you're in that sector, you probably feel that you're regulated through newswalk or other arrangements, through contract management arrangements. But from a regulatory system, there's no visibility, no collective visibility of that, of the performance of that system, and there's no traditional incentivisation of performance improvement that you can get through a regulated system, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. Oops, so there's a whole range of things, a whole range of government initiatives that are driving or are part of that transition process. There's a whole range of things that still have to be worked through. FACS is working through its commissioning model and what that means for it over time. There's a whole range of residual housing, what's left outside this transition process. A number of providers. What do we mean by wraparound services? What's the expectation for organisations that have traditionally been involved in tenant and asset management in providing and coordinating wraparound services? They're quite big issues for a range of community housing providers. Not necessarily issues for you, because you've been involved in that sort of business for a while. This is important because the government are very much aware that in transitioning this and doubling the size of the sector, they are transferring a lot of government risk to private sector. And the Minister's very clear with me, part of my role is to ensure the diversity of that sector, make sure the reputation of the sector is maintained so it can access those new financial opportunities that will come with this expansion, that there is an increase, there is a dividend for the people in New South Wales. There is increased affordable housing associated with this transition, but primarily make sure that this sector is not going to come apart at the seams and leave the government and the people in New South Wales exposed. So I don't want to talk too much about the performance of the Aboriginal housing sector. What I want to do over these next 2 days is talk about the performance of community housing providers within the national system itself. So I'll just highlight a few performance areas. In particular, this slide talks to performance and responsiveness to regulation of community housing providers within my jurisdiction. So we have the systems broken down to Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3s. Tier 3s are the smaller providers. And this slide shows the numbers of recommendations that they've had. This one on registration, so on entry, and this is in subsequent compliance assessments afterwards. So you can see on entry, about 25% of organisations don't have any recommendations coming into a system. Anyone who's been part of organisational provider behaviour, company behaviour in any regulated system, that is a substantially good effort to come into a regulatory environment and not have any recommendations to improve your performance. And along the way, you can see that builds to almost half of the organisations. So even if they did get a recommendation on entry, they subsequently respond to that and fix it, and they subsequently don't have recommendations. I've only got 2 providers in the community housing sector who have had recurring recommendations, who didn't fix the recommendations out of 145 odd. That's a very, very good performance. Those that have had subsequent recommendations, different recommendations, largely relate to changes in the system that they've responded to. So they've gone into expansion mode, taken on other business arrangements, etc. So that's the community housing sector by recommendations. I will call out the Tier 3 components, because a large number of Aboriginal housing providers, if they move into this system, will be in the Tier 3 world. Tier 3, very small operators generally. Some of them are quite big, but a very small footprint in housing. Very diverse across a whole range of different service provision components. But of them, of the ones that have gone through subsequent rounds, about 50% don't have subsequent recommendations either. So it doesn't, this trend is not related to size, it's not related to the business they're in. Some of them are dealing with the most at-risk clients in New South Wales, transition at-risk people, yet they are able to respond to regulatory insight, nudging from the regulator to improve their performance to the tune of 50%. Our experience with the Aboriginal housing sector is the numbers aren't the same. The performance is not like that. And I put that down to the inducements in the national system that encourage better practice, encourage responsiveness, so the system itself can build and grow. Whereas some of the other sectors that we can see into don't have those incentives and are very much a patchwork quilt where there's no imperative to improve performance. There are a range of powers that I have. We very rarely use any enforcement powers, as you can see by the performance of the community housing sector. There is no need to. It generally just takes a bit of a nudge and people respond to that nudge very well. Even when I go into investigations mode, where there's some egregious complaints, generally the investigation takes the organisation down a path of enlightenment and they improve their own performance along the way, and I don't have to take any action. I just want to give a quick overview of the differences between the national system and those that have been involved in the PARS system over the last few years. There's some really clear and immediate differences. On the one hand, it looks pretty much the same. There's performance outcomes, you measure against those on some sort of scheduled basis. Analytical people look through your reports, you provide that to the regulator, and that gets assessed and you get a performance outcome from it. There are a range of slight differences to it. What I'd point to is there's some range of really quite fundamental differences between the two systems. And I want to try and explore those over the sessions I've got. There is certainly this issue between Tier 1s and 2s and Tier 3s. Tier 1s and 2s are treated in quite a rigorous monitoring regime, and Tier 3s aren't given the same level of rigour by the regulator. There's a lot of flexibility to how analysts look at Tier 3s based on their own business models, and they're looked at with less scrutiny over a less period of time. And we're looking amongst the regulators to review how Tier 3s are regulated in this financial year. So there's quite a big review of that going on. But largely, some of the differences about financial sustainability, the reputation of the sector is important, and regulators can take action against organisations who are impacting the reputation of the sector. So it's not just about your own performance, it's about how your performance impacts on the sector itself. So some of those issues and differences are quite significant when it gets down to your choice or organisational choice to become part of a national system. So there's a number of issues to consider, and again we'll explore these over the next couple of sessions as well, and happy to talk out a session for your own particular circumstances. The contract management system is a form of regulation, and that's what largely Aboriginal housing providers have been subject to, or the Newswalk system. A large part of that, yes, generates some push to improve performance, but related to contract standards for a particular set of systems. When you shift into a compliance world, there is less room to move if you're no longer financially viable, or you're showing signs of decreasing financial viability, or your governance isn't right, or there's gaps or weaknesses, or you don't collect the rent. You don't do those basic things, you can't operate in the system. You actually can't get into the system in the first place. So all the things that Darren talked about and considerations of joining a regulated system are certainly key elements that all organisations need to consider very carefully before joining the system. The good news is, as Wendy was talking about, there's a series of capacity building mechanisms which will assist you and assist everyone in the room if you choose to go down that path to improve in some of those areas. I'll cover off registration processes and so on at the next session, but I'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks all.